Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker shills, dead slaves, serfs, peasants, vassals. You know the drill. I'm a useful idiot, and today I want to talk about this gray area between freedom fighters and terrorists. And the reason why I bring that up is because one has to be very careful in sifting through the media, the way and the way our government presents combatants overseas. For example, the fact that under the Obama administration, and this was true under Bush as well, anyone that is a male of combat age between the ages of something like 14 and 24, if they're killed, they're counted as a militant, simply because they're between that age group and they're males. So they're referred to as militants. And we also find that the term terrorism and terrorist is being used to get for a broad spectrum of crimes, drug crimes, political crimes, religious crimes, and as well as domestic terrorists. So people in the United States who are constitutionalists and ex-veterans and the like are now considered potential domestic terrorists. So I just want to look a little closer at how this term is used and show you how the state and the state throughout history has used this term and blurred the lines of who is the good guys and who's the bad guys. And of course, this has a time-honored tradition in wartime demonization. Who can forget all the scathing indictments and racist attacks on the Japanese used in American propaganda during World War II, and the propaganda against Germany as well, and the propaganda that was used against Germany during World War I, talking about the Huns coming to rape your mothers and daughters. And so interestingly enough, after the war is over, great efforts have to be made to repatriate everyone to love Germany and Japan. Of course, they don't have any problem with that now. It's easy to see that they are, the greatest allies of the United States and very close friends. And yet at one point, it was necessary to demonize them as subhuman animals filled with bloodlust. And so now we have a world where there are people striving for nationhood and people striving to fight against occupations and people fighting against foreigners with all sorts of political and religious ideologies and goals and agendas. And so we often see all of them referred to as terrorists. And I just want to look a little bit at history and look at the fact that whether someone is a freedom fighter or a terrorist can sometimes be a very thin line indeed, especially when it comes to governments and media. And we saw that most recently in Libya. I remember having arguments with compatriots and discussing the idea that it's hard to tell. Some people felt like the people fighting against Gaddafi were freedom fighters, and other people thought that they were terrorists. And of course, we see the same thing in Syria now. But let's get to a little history. A good example is during the American Revolution, the British referred to American colonists and people who resisted the British as terrorists. And so that's a very notable example because we used unconventional methods because we had to economically pit ourselves and strategically and tactically pit ourselves against the greatest military empire in the world at that time. And so we resorted to unconventional tactics. So the American patriots were referred to as terrorists. But of course, to us, they are freedom fighters. Then you have the abolitionists who wanted to, who took violent means in the pre-Civil War years because they wanted to abolish slavery. And of course, they were called terrorists, and yet through history, now they are noted as noble freedom fighters. And then we have the Philippines, the American Philippines. So during the Spanish-American War, the United States got the Philippines from Spain, as well as Cuba. And when we first got into the Philippines, we were greeted as liberators, and the Philippines thought they were going to get their own country back in their independence. Instead, America occupied them and then brutally suppressed an insurrection there. And the United States considered them terrorists and treated them as such, and brutally repressed the insurrection there. But of course, in Philippines history, they are freedom fighters. And so there we find that again. And then we have Chechnya. Chechnya wants to be independent. Like so many other ex-Soviet republics, they wanted to be their own country of Chechnya. And people who fight against the Soviets refer to Chechens insurrectionists as terrorists, and therefore they can treat them completely differently. And of course, in Chechnya, they're considered freedom fighters. And this distinction is important too, because if we look in the United States now, we have a whole new set of laws and non-laws and extra constitutional powers granted to the president and the government, all in the name of fighting terrorism, because we have a whole new set of laws to be applied to terrorism. So we have to be very careful here, because if terrorism can be applied to anyone, anywhere, for any reason, and these whole separate set of laws apply to them, we are indeed getting into some dark territory. So then we get to more recent times. We have the Afghans. So we have the Afghans fighting the Soviets, and when the Afghan Mujahideen radical Islamists were fighting the Soviets, they were freedom fighters. And in fact, they were greeted at the White House, and Reagan praised them as freedom fighters, and a great example for the world when they fought the Soviets. But then when the United States is in Afghanistan, and Al-Qaeda is no longer there, and we have the Taliban, who are the Afghans, fighting against the United States occupation. Now, those same freedom fighters are now terrorists, and so they are treated as such. So there's a good example of the irony. And then more recently, we have, like I brought up earlier, the Libyan situation. We have Syria, where the people fighting the Syrian government are both terrorists and freedom fighters, actually there. And now we have the situation in Mali, too, where we have a separatist movement in the north who now has affiliations with Al-Qaeda, but was initially more interested in freedom for their people. And Palestine, obviously, is a good example of this as well. They are considered terrorists by Israel, and but for the Palestinians, the radical elements like Hamas are freedom fighters, and then the Kurds as well. The Kurds are considered terrorists by some elements of Iraq. The Peshmerga are probably considered terrorists. The Turkish have problems with so-called Kurdish terrorists in their south, and yet the Kurds are freedom fighters in their mythology, in their history, and in their eyes. So I just bring this up because I don't necessarily suggest that all freedom fighters are not terrorists, and all terrorists are not freedom fighters. I'm just saying that it's rather convenient that depending on which country they're in, for example, Al-Qaeda, if they're in Libya, then they're freedom fighters. If they're in Syria, they are freedom fighters. If they are in Afghanistan, they are terrorists. If they're in Iraq, they're terrorists. And so it goes. So we just have to be careful and keep our eyes open when we see this term and these new sets of laws applied so liberally to such a broad spectrum. And like I say, the bottom line for me is just what a strange thing that we have such a gray area between freedom fighters and terrorists, and that sometimes they're interchangeable, particularly when it comes to foreign policy. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.